Welcome to the Women in Public Policy Program's Seminar Series podcast at the Harvard Kennedy School.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the WAP seminar for this week. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome Stephanie Creary, one of our very own. Stephanie served as a research associate here at the Harvard Business School for a number of years before taking a faculty position at the Cornell S.C. Johnson School of Business, and she's now at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Stephanie received many of her degrees from Boston College or Boston University.
I've been in all of them.
Okay, Boston University and Boston College, as well as an MBA from Simmons. So in her research, Professor Creary studies how workers learn from their differences and reveals how they engage their multiple identities in an enhancing way to cultivate positive identities and improve the quality of relationships across difference. So today what we're going to hear about is what does it mean to help, investigating the helping orientations of men working in elite jobs. Please join me in welcoming Professor Stephanie Creary.
Thank you all so much for coming. This is exciting. I spent 16 years of my life in this town. I've been to so many of the universities as a student and also worked at this fantastic one. And I owe so much of my ability to be here today and to talk about this presentation to the sets of experiences that I myself had. So I want to acknowledge a couple of people who have helped me get to where I am today, and certainly through the help that they provided me have allowed me to think about this as a topic worthy of research. First, Hannah Riley Bowles is somebody who I met. I'm going to age myself and the rest of us very quickly in the next 5 minutes. Hannah is somebody who I met 12 years ago when I was in my MBA program at Simmons, and I lived in an apartment in Charlestown with 3 other women, tiny, tiny space. And one of my roommates I was talking about what I might do after my MBA. I didn't think I wanted a corporate job. It didn't sound like me. I started thinking about maybe a PhD in organizational behavior. I had some great mentors at Simmons who were saying maybe you want to become a professor, but I was like, more school, that sounds terrible. And my roommate, who is not in this field, actually happened to know Hannah. She says, I think I might know somebody who is doing what you want to do. She's a professor at the Kennedy School. Would you like to meet her? And I'm thinking she would never want to talk to me because I have no connection to her. Hannah said, come on down. And so I came here somewhere in one of these rooms, sat down with Hannah, and she sort of talked me through this whole process of what it was like to get a PhD, what it was like to be a woman in a predominantly a male-dominated field. So the other person, sort of at the same time, who I came into contact with was Robin Ely at the business school. So part of the work that she does at the Center for Gender and Organizations at Simmons College puts her into contact with many of the MBA students there at the time. And so I had heard her come and present her paper on rethinking political correctness with Martin Davidson and Deb Meyerson. And I ended up going up to her afterwards and saying, is there any more things that you've written that would help me to understand this context? And she says, why don't you just come visit me at Harvard at business school? And I'm thinking, why is she so nice? This is crazy. If you know Robin, this is actually what she does. And so she was the second person who helped me talk about why I might want to get a PhD in organizational behavior, but she was also somebody who helped me to understand that studying research on diversity could potentially be a viable career opportunity. At the same time, Robin introduced me to Professor David Thomas, which is who I RA'd for 4 years. And so my whole notion of what diversity looks like from a practice perspective comes from all the work that David and I did together during my time here. So I wanted to sort of acknowledge that because those interactions inform so much of what this perspective is today, the notions of that help is necessary to get into positions that are considered elite. And when we think about who actually holds the positions and the source of resources that allow people to get into the elite, it happens to be men, particularly in this country. So my co-authors are Brianna Barca-Kaza, who's a professor at University of Manitoba, Heis Gibson, who in here besides Lumumba knows Heis Gibson? Okay, so he graduated in 2015. We were in our PhDs in Boston at the same time from HBS, from the TOM program, wrote his dissertation on the Army. He's at West Point now. So much of our ability to access people for this study and so much of our fact-checking around are we making stuff up or is this real does come from the fact that he's an insider, he's active duty, now soon to be, he's getting his ceremony as soon, colonel in the U.S. Army. Laura Morgan Roberts, who's a former HBS professor, as well as Erin Kaza, who's actually married to Brianna, who's on the study as well. So let me just sort of set this tone for you here. This is what you might already know. For some of you, this might be new. But the idea that when we think about senior leadership positions, which I'm constructing as elite jobs, there continues to be a dearth of women and minorities in these positions in both the private and the public sectors. So if we start with the private sector, 5% of Fortune 500 CEOs are women. There's an interesting New York Times piece very recently, within the last month, that said there are more male CEOs named John than there are women CEOs in the Fortune 500. Less than 1% of Fortune 500 CEOs are black. There are 3 black male CEOs, TIAA-CREF, JCPenney, and at Merck. There has only been 1 black female CEO in the Fortune 500, Ursula Burns, who retired from Xerox. There are currently no black female CEOs in the Fortune 500. If we turn to particularly the Army, 5% of U.S. general officers are women, and 8% of U.S. general officers are black, which is stark if you especially look at the fact of the enlisted force of the U.S. Army. More than 30% of enlisted officers are African American. The numbers are smaller for other racial groups, and I'm not going to talk too much about other racial groups right now because I think the biggest numbers are in the African American minority group. But if you do have questions about other races and how they fare relative to some of what I've talked about today, I'd be happy to answer those questions. Okay, so let me sort of set the conceptual stage by saying, again, reiterating that in order to get into these high status or elite jobs, we know that health is necessary for upward mobility. We know this both from a knowledge, scientific perspective, but also from a practical perspective as well. So what is an elite job? An elite job is one that is considered to have prestigious work. It's what everybody wants to do because it affords me a certain level of status. People who are in these jobs have control over valued and scarce resources, and they're known, the job holders are known to have some type of advantage, material or symbolic, because they hold these jobs. So this notion of symbolic advantage is people might give you the benefit of the doubt when you're offering a suggestion, because you hold this job, and so they're presuming and projecting rightfully or wrongfully all sorts of competence based on what you're saying. So that's what we're talking about. But we do know from past research, Lauren Rivera, who's a professor at Kellogg, as well as David Thomas in his book about the careers of minority executives, we do know that in order to get and perform well in these jobs, that support from senior members of the organization occupation is important. So this is what's established. But if we look at this idea of helping more broadly, particularly in the organizational studies literature, so I come from organizational behavior, organizational studies, which obviously borrows a lot from it, sociology, psychology, is that as we think about what help means in the literature, it's often constructed in a very feminine way. We tend to focus more on women as the helpers, which ends up meaning it's often stereotyped as women's work, marginalized as women's work, and not viewed as leadership. And so there is another body of literature on helping at work that doesn't focus on gender and race or any type of dimension of difference. It talks about tasks. So I am on a project team, I need some assistance, job-related assistance. How might I get help or support? These two themes are going to come up later in the data, which is why I profile them now. The reality is, if we take in total past research in the literature, we know that help, our help that we've been given, the help that we offer to others, is not always evenly distributed across gender and race. We know that men's networks are largely male-dominated. Females' networks are largely female-dominated, and so that means we tend to help people who are similar to us along the dimensions of first gender, but also race. We don't have a lot of research other than that on cross-race developmental research, cross-race developmental relationships and networks to sort of look across race and gender. But I think it's interesting to know that we do already have this assumption that people aren't helping people always just because it's my job or it's the right thing to do. It tends to lean towards who do I perceive is like me and that I feel comfortable with. So last spring, I came to the HBS Gender and Work Conference, which is focusing on the Black experience at work. And just before I presented this, there was a diversity leader from PricewaterhouseCoopers who was giving her presentation. And in her presentation, she showed this video that's actually part of a larger initiative that they refer to as Outsmarting Human Minds. All these videos are accessible on their website. And Professor Banaji is actually a contributor to this, and this is actually linked to an effort around making people aware of their unconscious biases that's linked to Harvard University. So you might be interested, if you don't already know, to look at the videos. They're very cool. So I'm going to show you this one because I think this one actually captures in a very concise way the phenomenon that I'm interested in and that we talked about in the study. So I'm going to let you go ahead and play. Keep watching that video because I think it certainly sets the context for the things that I think are going to become more apparent when I show you the data, but also as we think about why this larger idea is vitally important to consider and to come up with solutions around in practice. So what are we interested in? So this is actually going to be our findings on a qualitative study. So induction means that we have a vague idea of what we're interested in going in, and what's fantastic is all that I'm about to share with you was not what I originally thought that I was studying. So let me be clear about that, and then the research questions that I share with you here reflect what closely matches the story as it evolved. Happy to answer later questions around what did I originally think I was studying and how did we get here. So we're examining the important role that helping plays in the career paths of women and minorities in these elite jobs, particularly using the perspectives and actions of men who hold the majority of these roles. So we are interested in answering questions around who, how, and why. Who do men working in these jobs help? What are the ways that they help? And what are their motives for helping? And so we're going to unpack together today this broad notion of helping and what that might look like as we move forward. Okay, so methods. This is an inductive qualitative study, as I mentioned. This is just part one today. We are continuing to collect data. I'll be transparent about that, and I'll tell you about the plans going forward at the end. It's based on interviews with 34 Army officers, 32 men, and 2 women. The women are African-American women. The men are approximately 50% black and 50% white, 17 black men, 15 white men. We obviously oversampled black men to do this study. We have experience on the team of trying to publish diversity research, and I don't know if any of you here is interested in publishing diversity research, but one of the things that we know happens is that particularly if there's something off in terms of the demographic dimensions that you represent and the people who you're studying. The people who are reviewing it say is your effects based on the fact that you were different. So we thought about all of this before we went in. And so I'm the black woman interviewer. My friend Brianna is the white woman interviewer, and her husband Aaron is a mixed race ethnicity man interviewer. We're actually more concerned about the gender dynamic than we were about the race ethnicity dynamic, because we did many of these interviews over phone because some of these people were in Afghanistan and Iraq and faraway places. We have 2 non-interviewers on the team. Tice is our insider. He's the colonel in the Army who knows all of these people, so he does not do the interviews. What is great about this is he's our test to the fact that we're not making this up. So we have somebody who's high ranking in these jobs who we could say, this is the story that we think as it unfolds, and he says, yeah, that sounds about right. Or you might also want to consider this. And then we have another, Laura Maureen Roberts. She is not a non-interviewer, but she's certainly somebody who is well-versed in the literature that we're playing around in and the phenomenon as a whole. So these elite jobs are, as we operationalize them, we talk about them as elite divisions, like the 82nd Airborne. This is actually the division that Heiss commanded after he graduated with his doctorate here. It is, for those of you who know your military history or don't, it was one of the first divisions to parachute during the battle at Normandy during World War II. Special Forces units and assignments like Pentagon assignments and others with the Secretary of the General. So these folks are in these really elite high status jobs. We did not originally go in because we were studying elite jobs. What happened was that I started interviewing people and they started talking about having contacts with 1-star generals and people who were in really high positions. And I asked elite, I said, who are these people you introduced us to? And then I realized that they were people who were really in unique positions that were not positions that everybody can get into very easily. And so we ended up bounding, but actually took the opportunity to construct our ideas around those individuals. So it's grounded theory, which is a qualitative technique that allows you to go back and forth between the data you are collecting, existing literature to develop and construct new insights. We've gone through the interviews 3 times. After each round, we've presented it, much like this, to a group of people who's asked us 1,000 questions. And so that's also informed our next round of data analysis and data collection. So in our first round, we understood that the themes around helping were strong in our sample, and it wasn't something that we originally went in studying. So we actually went into the transcripts looking for general attitudes towards helping behaviors, potential motives, and experiences of being helped or not in their careers. In the second round, we took a deeper dive into similarities and differences in helping by race, because it started to seem in our early research that black men and white men were talking about helping differently. So the next round, we actually went in and coded differences and similarities for black and white men. And then the last round was the elephant in the room is women here. What was interesting to me as I did most of the interviews is that what was, I think, fascinating and something that I was continuing to struggle with in this study was the notion that when I typically do this type of research on corporate actors, there's a lot more comfort, or it comes across as a lot more comfort talking about gender and not a lot of comfort talking about race. When I did these interviews, there was a lot more comfort even from the white men talking about race and not about gender. So this was a kind of a surreal flip the world experience for me. And so right now, the data on women are still at a superficial level, but now going into the next round, when we have a relationship with them, we're hoping that it'll be a little bit easier to dive a little bit more deeply into our insights around gender.
So Stephanie?
Yes.
Given that you're so interested in gender and a lot of this helping research has been gendered, can you maybe explain why you didn't have any more women or white women in this? That there are only 2 women and 32 men? Yeah,
so we went in also not trying to study men. This was a function of, I think what always happens in social science research is how do you get people to participate in a study when their representation is so small in the sample. So we've sort of tried all sorts of things, is even to get the people who were in the study to refer us to more women as participants, but we are struggling to get women to participate in this study. So that's sort of the reality of this. I will tell you that the data for the 2 black women, the stories are markedly different. And so I think anecdotally I will talk about this. I cannot make any scientific claims around them, but if you're interested in knowing how they differ, I will tell you sort of at a high level, because I think it would be great to have more, but it's can't get them to participate right now. I think that also might speak to the climate that they're in the workplace, and so we have to sort of do more around that to get beyond. That was a great question. Okay, so at a high level, here's what I'm going to reveal to you, and I will share with you over time some quotes, some illustrated quotes from the interviews. So what we have here are similarities and differences in black and white officers' perspectives on helping at work in terms of how they've been helped, the types of help they feel like they've gotten, and the where and from whom that help has come from. Different notions of how they've helped others, their direct reports versus women and minorities. And then some, right now, we have some preliminary understanding of motives for help. Some of this is about, I do this because it's my job to do it, and some of it's about, I recognize the unique challenges that women and minorities have in the Army, and either because I represent that group, or because through secondhand experience, I heard of someone who had this experience once, and so I want to be helpful. So let me talk first about being helped, the top level, in terms of the similarities across men in this sample, and then I'll talk about the black-white differences in their descriptions of what it meant for them or how they were helped in their careers. So men largely reported receiving job-related assistance, how to do the task. They were reported receiving career mentorship and developmental opportunities, and I separate these because the developmental opportunities were certain schools that you have to go to in order to get to the next level, so ranger school, or a certain assignment like getting a command position in order to get into a colonel ranked role. The differences were white men were more likely to talk about, frankly, having an advocate. And the fact that their advocate was somebody who was not just their supervisor, but someone really senior, like a one-star general at an early stage of their career. This notion of having an advocate was not prominent in the narratives of black men. They did talk about receiving encouragement and support, but that often came from other people, external groups. Like, I'll talk about the ROCs as an organization, which is pretty much your standard external organization filled with African-American officers who help and support each other and make sure that people have the information and the resources that they need, and people who weren't their supervisors. In terms of their ideas of, at least their perceptions on who they were helping, similarly, they reported that they were providing the direct reports as a whole with job-related assistance, and that they were providing people, and I'm purposely being vague here, people with career support that could help them to be successful. However, black men were more likely to talk about the importance of deliberately helping women and members of different minority groups. That doesn't mean that white men didn't help, it just meant that without my prompting, they're talking about, I intentionally tried to help women and minorities because I know the struggles they're facing. Black men were more likely to talk about, I'm giving advice because I wasn't given it and I think people need to have it. And black men were more likely to talk about encouraging others to be authentic at work, which I thought was interesting given that this is the military and uniformity is really, in standard operating procedures, is really what they value. But this notion of there was some level of authenticity that was important, and I want to have those conversations with people, I think is certainly something that black men talked a lot about. And again, these are perceptions of how I've helped. So let me give you some evidence, some quotes. I think it's always important to make the stories come alive. So if we just start with the similarities. Mentorship. This was just people talking about getting mentors or having mentors. Having just a select group of mentors really also helped me to get to where I'm at today. Another person says, I had a mentor or a sponsor or somebody that was going to help me out because, like I said, when I was a lieutenant, the change was I finally got a black battalion commander. That's when I started getting noticed. With respect to developmental opportunities, this is somebody talking about being at this 4-year mark in their career. They left one fort, they went to another fort, and they were able to get into this engineer captain career course, which is effectively a developmental opportunity, leadership development opportunity, which is that next level junior grade officer training that helps prepare junior officers for company command. So here are the differences, and let me just point out W is white, B is black, P is participant, and the number is just their identifier, their unique identifier. So this is a white officer saying, one of my bosses, I talked to him and he said, hey, stay in, give it one more try. You've only been in one unit and this is one side of the Army. Go somewhere else and see a different part of the Army. So he helped me to get the slot to get into the infantry course and then go to Ranger School right after that. And so is anybody here in the room actually active duty officer? Okay, so this is not, Ranger School's a big deal, right? This is not like a small assignment. So the fact that this person's narrating a story saying they helped me to get this slot that very few people get, that is really important, especially if we compare it to this next story here. The Army has the whole counseling and mentorship thing, all these different things that your immediate supervisor is supposed to do for you to help build you up, teach you the right way, and allow you to do the same thing for everybody else. And that system is broken when it comes to mostly minority officers. So the ROCs, this external group filled with African American active duty and some, I think, retired officers will actually help you out. So this is not the same story. And we found that was a large dominant theme in our data. So let's turn to my perceptions of how I help others. Commonly, we had reports of providing job-related assistance, so this is kind of real benign. I'm working every day, just working hard, trying to get people ready to deploy, and that's what I was doing. I was getting guys ready to deploy. People would show up, I would hand them a training plan and help them manage their training, right? That's help. Career support. As I developed junior officers, I really spent a lot of time. I have been doing a lot of reading and focus on leadership at the organizational level, not because they're absolutely going to use it in the next 3 to 5 years, but what I wanted them to understand was leadership was important, whether they were in a platoon or they're on staff. So this is what I do for everybody, train them how to be leaders. So here are the differences in perceptions of helping. Black officer talking about offering advice that this person wasn't given. So I would say that there have been times where I felt isolated or excluded from discussions, partially because of and I'm not going to say discrimination. They were very conscious of not saying that they were discriminated against. I would say that it is either ignorance or just a stereotype that I wouldn't be interested in this particular role. There's a lot to be said for perspectives and the wisdom of time, with this notion that over time, maybe people are changing their mindsets. But like I said, the whole point of this was me helping others with the things I don't think were provided to me. And this is a Black officer talking about the importance of thinking about the unique situations that women and minorities are facing, and at least helping them by talking about it and being transparent about it. So this interview was done, as many things I've done lately, right around the time of the post-election. And so what this person was reflecting on is this politics is not something that enters into their everyday practice. Like, you cannot talk about politics. It's just not something that is done. And it's not something that you're allowed to do. But this person wanted to recognize that the larger political discourse was affecting the women and the minorities in the military. And so they said, we can't talk about politics in the office, but this is affecting the social dynamic that minorities, including women, including gays, lesbians, and all the other communities, are having to deal with this by themselves and figure out how to get through this. The leadership is not opening the door to say this is who we are as Americans, who we are as a military, and really what we value, I think is what this person was getting at. And so we have to take a constant effort to be diverse and inclusive. I'm saying inclusive to be very particular on the fact that just because you have the numbers, representation of minorities, doesn't mean that's helping your organization. So this person was very bothered by the fact that we're not helping, but we're saying we want to, and we need to be a little bit more conscientious about that. And so then the last part that I'm going to give you here is specifically what we coded on helping women, and this is what we're going to have to dive into more deeply in a data way, but at least to give you some general impressions. So it was very painfully obvious to me at time how much in doing these interviews with these men that they were either using the word men all the time to refer to leaders, or they were correcting themselves midstream and apologizing to me. And so I need to probe more about, I feel like I know why they're doing this, but I want to get on record sort of how that has been socialized to do that. I am perceiving that might be about helping women, but anyway, I just want to throw that out there. Men they talked about using supportive narratives about women's competency, so going to other male officers and talking about, no, it's really great to have women here. Guess what? They perform well. And then providing them with job-related assistance, and here are the differences. Black men were more likely to talk about the unique challenges and discrimination that women face, and white men were more likely to talk about treating women as equals. So, using gender-inclusive language, this is an example of the part that I was telling you about correcting and apologizing to me. One thing I've learned, and it was always taught to me as well when we were growing up, is that the Army is a young man's game. Sorry, it's either a young man's or a woman's game. We ask our young men and women in uniform to do some extraordinary things, and they do that selflessly, a lot of times at a great cost to themselves personally and to the people who they care about. So I thought it was interesting how it was man, then woman and men, but it wasn't people. So that was sort of what I was thinking about there, and then using supportive narratives around women's competency. The women in the military is a big deal, right? That's been a big topic for a long time. There are guys that ask me about that right now because they have not been in there with a woman yet. They are in artillery units. I have to tell them straight up, I say, I've had 3 female lieutenants. All 3 of them were awesome. All 3 of them were probably my top 5% of lieutenants out of the 38 in our battalion. And then here are the differences. Black officer says, I sat my female lieutenant down with the door open, of course. I said, 1, you need to go to find a female mentor. I said, I'm black, but I'm not a female. There's certain shit I can't tell you that I don't know. And the men are going to say stuff, and they're not trying to hurt your feelings at all. They're trying to make you one of the boys as much as possible. And it's going to sound idiotic. The minute you lash out in public, you're the bitch. And they're going to ostracize you, and you're going to fail. Even though I'm the commander, there's nothing I can do to help you. Counter narrative. White man says, I give female subordinates the same kind of guidance that I give everyone. Bloom where you're planted. Do the best you can in any opportunity that you've been given. Take advantage of the opportunities that are presented to you, and know that if an opportunity comes up, that whoever is offering you that opportunity sees something in you, and really then it's on you to kind of step into the role and perform at that point in time. So just do your best at that, and then really figure out a way to get the team together to accomplish the mission. Yes, Linda.
For the black quote at the very end, is he talking about structurally he can't help, or is he also talking about him being the unique challenges of him being black that he has less? Okay.
It's both. Yeah. He felt very, it's the risk. It's personal risk to do it, but also there's nothing structurally that's going to change anytime soon was also his perception. That's where it helps to have done the whole interview, but yeah, it's both of those things. Okay, that's my last data slide, and I'm going to wrap it up here in just a second to just summarize this whole study for you so far, where we are. And I'm really curious about getting your perspectives, not only in making this come alive even more, but where we should go next. So men's personal experience with being helped, commonly they described receiving similar types of help at work over the course of their careers, yet men revealed some differences in who has provided them with these types of help. Men's perspectives on helping others. Men describe providing similar types of job-related assistance and career advice to direct reports, but black men were more likely to recognize the unique challenges and talk about the intentionality with which they've provided help to women and minorities. Intentionality really is the key word. And I don't want you to feel that it's not that, or to walk away thinking that white men aren't helping. It's just this level of intentionality and structure through which these black men are perceiving that they're taking on the responsibility. So here's where we're going. Second round interviews are happening now, following up with these 34 officers to ask more questions about helping at work. And one really fantastic officer kept sending me stuff that wasn't confidential, and one of the things that he sent me was his command philosophy. Apparently when they go to this command course, you learn how to think about yourself as a leader and what you want to do to develop other people. And so I read through it, and it has all this great OB leadership stuff on it. I want to get these. We want to get these from the other officers. I'd be interested to see if anybody writes anything about women and minorities on these. I don't know if that's going to happen, but at least to have some data around that. And we are moving into the process of, we want to see if perception is reality around who they're helping. Where we think our opportunity is that leadership is a big deal in the military, especially in the Army. I've ended these interviews saying, hearing, do you have any feedback for me? Can you send me some books on leadership so I could be a better leader? So we think that if we ask, hey, we'd like you to sort of solicit some feedback, which we typically do. Reflective best self is one vehicle, but we also want to make sure that we're not just giving people really positive stories about your relationship with your direct supports and how they perceive your leadership, that doesn't seem foreign. It actually seems like it would be aligned with their expectations as leaders. And so collecting those in written narratives is what we plan on doing next. And then we are going to say that we will provide this feedback to you and offer you some personal coaching from a group of experts on how to improve your leadership skills. The part that's not up here is how to get this information, which we think is really great, to the right people in the Army. And so that's what Piza's job is, to think about this. I don't really have any thoughts on that because I'm not in the military and I don't know how that system works. So theoretically, for people who are interested, we think we have something like a theory of high status members helping orientations in high status jobs. We want to contribute to the literature on diversity, career mobility, and inequality at work, particularly these perspectives on being helped and helping women and minorities of other minority groups, members of other minority groups, and then this broader literature on helping, which we pieced together as being about relational practice and gendered notions of helping, and helping more broadly, sources and motives for helping, particularly women and members of other minority groups. Thank you. I'd be interested in your comments, feedback. I'm going to grab my paper. Yeah, so I'll open it up. Yes, hi.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation. My question relates to a lecture actually I heard from Professor Livingston when I came here for New Edmund Day and very recently. I would like to ask you to elaborate maybe your definition of helping. Because when we heard Professor Livingston present, we were talking about social networks, but he made a very interesting and a very important distinction, which I felt was really important, between mentorship and sponsorship. And I think it's really important when you're talking about elite jobs and moving into the next position. I think there is a fine line there and a very important distinction. I mean, I think as women, I think we do get a lot of opportunities for mentorship, maybe, you know. There may be, and I think in some structures it is restrictive, I recognize that. But I think it's also important to move from mentorship to sponsorship if you're looking to move up positions and so on and so forth, because you can get a lot of good advice, but how do you actually make those changes? And I think, you know, in my naive understanding, I think sponsorship kind of plays an important role. So can you tell us a little bit more about maybe some definition about helping and making some distinctions on that?
So fantastic insights in question. Let me sort of work backward because this is, so I actually teach, I was hired at Wharton last year to teach the first sets of diversity classes to classes for undergrads and classes for MBAs. And so the MBA sections comes up a lot. And so I said, however, I think there's this other notion of sponsorship that often doesn't get put into the definition. It's called advocacy. Because sponsorship can be, you know, I'm going to say you should be someone who should have this opportunity. Advocacy means you're going to bat for them when everybody else is saying, no, I don't think so, right? So I think that that notion of sponsorship still needs a lot of work around it, because I think we've seen that in research and practice that sponsorship can look different for people based on personal risk and whether or not people feel like they have the ability to really go and negotiate these opportunities for people. So I think what is a contribution, a potential contribution of this work is taking apart these different notions of helping. So for us, it's not about our definition of helping, it's about their definition of helping, and then comparing their definition of helping to how we construct helping in the literature. So the notion, so the research around mentorship, sponsorship, developmental opportunities is a very different literature from this task-based helping, right? And so if my notion of helping as an Army officer is about task-based helping, then this other literature, these other insights around mentorship, developing people, advocacy, might not play into what I'm thinking. So I think that that's our contribution, is actually enlivening the ways we think about and talk about and study helping behaviors. Great question. Here, and then to Robert.
So I'm just curious about your future studies, and I know that you picked this target audience because you had access to military officers. I'm assuming is that correct? Because I'm just wondering if you could generalize this, or how you plan on maybe expanding the audience to other places, because there's a different culture in the military. And so how would this study, so if you took this study and then did one on the civilian workforce, or even, you know, private industry workforce, would the data look the same?
Right. So this is a great questions around methods, and when you're using inductive, qualitative methods, what are you trying to do and what are you not trying to do, right? So qualitatively, we talk about this as transferability, not generalizability, because generalizability is all about the statistical stuff, right? Transferability is about this notion of how do we change the way we think about knowledge? So if our knowledge of helping is firmly rooted in, like, helping is a woman's thing, or helping is really just about tasks, how does this study help us to understand helping differently? So it's not necessarily about transferring to other organizations as much as it's about changing knowledge and the way that we think about what it means to help. That's the first part. I think the second part is why this context helps us is we talk about when we have cases that maybe don't seem as normal, we talk about these as extreme cases. Because in studying extreme cases, we learn new things about the world. If all we do is study the same stuff, consultants and bankers all the time, which is what happens in my field, then all our knowledge is fundamentally about consultants and bankers, let's be honest. If all we do is study leaders who are men and white men, and we don't admit that they're white men, then really all of our leadership theories are, guess what, about white men, right? So that's why we study things that seem a little different, because our presumptions around what mentorship, what sponsors, what helping is really fundamentally built on a unique set of people. Does that help? All right. I could say more if you want to, but I figured I would stop myself. Before I get on a roll, yes. Robert, yes.
Yeah. So, you know, in light of the Banaji video that you showed, my assumption is that the rationale, the impetus for a lot of this work is looking at cross-group helping, so how you help people who are different from yourself.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you've considered or looked at a difference in how white males help white women versus black males versus black women, because as you know, the sexism literature is quite different than the racism literature, and it shows that it's actually very consistent with the role of maleness and masculinity to be the white knight and rescue or help women. In fact, the research shows that women are penalized for not accepting help, right? And that's consistent with the whole benevolent sexism. And so there's this sort of tendency and incentive to offer help to women, and I wonder if there's these differences in the extent to which help, whether it's task-based or whatever, or mentorship or sponsorship, the help is extended to women versus extended to males of a different ethnic group, and whether you're even interested in that distinction.
I'm really interested. I think it's fascinating. I would love to get there, and because you're an expert on this, I want to add in one more dimension, is to talk about, we know each other, right, is our expectations of women versus black women versus white women. Can you say a little bit about that? Because I think when you're bound up in what you're saying is we have certain role expectations for white women, or men might have certain role expectations for white women, but they might have different ones for black women, and so the helping might look a little differently. So can you like postulate some more about this?
In like 30 seconds?
Yes,
okay.
like 30 seconds.
So basically, one of the fundamental pillars of sexism and benevolent sexism is that there's a high level of interdependence between men and women, and so they have this contract where men help women, they provide affection and protection as long as women assume the appropriate subordinate role. That's for white men and white women. And so what we found is that black women don't have the same level of interdependence, and they also don't represent the same level of threat as black men, and so they end up being marginalized rather than subordinated or stigmatized, which I don't have time to explain what those mean, which ironically gives both more freedom to black women vis-a-vis white women, because they're not being watched or kept in line or surveilled as tightly, and also more disadvantaged because they're 2 degrees removed from the prototype of a white male leader because they don't have maleness or whiteness. And so it ends up creating this complex pool of both extreme social disadvantage and attenuation of some disadvantages that maybe black men face. So it's a really complex, so the intersectionality work shows that they're not the sum of their parts, that when you start crossing ethnicity and gender, you get interesting results for Latino women, Asian women, black women that are neither traditional gender results nor traditional race results, which tend to be male.
Thank you so much. That's why he's here. I'm just trying to follow that, right? So I think what's important to understand is when we can get at this, it's powerful. It's just hard because I have people who participate, in the studies, and that's part of the challenge, is we acknowledge where we have the opportunities, and if we can get them, it's great. And then we always acknowledge the 85 limitations of our study, saying, yeah, I could only get 2 women to participate in the study. I don't know why. I have to figure that out. And it's not because we didn't try all these strategies, but there is much deeper understanding of the complexities of the workplace when we start looking at intersections of race and gender, certainly. Mumba.
Yeah, so picking up on that, I was really interested in like the intentionality difference in intentionality that you're talking about, and I'm just wondering how you're thinking about these intrapersonal identities, so race and gender, that are to what extent would you say in your data, or would you be thinking about going forward that it's intersecting with the position as well? And so kind of the question I would have is for like the black male officer, and going back to this like risk, right? Is it risky? I'm being intentional, and to what extent is how I help is interacting with my sense of myself as a black male, and I know I'm going to be, but also is it, to what extent is also because I'm a black male officer and I have to maintain legitimacy about that because of my goal, and just really thinking about the internal dynamics and how they're thinking about their multiple identities and their own unique challenges. And is it unique because of the social ones, or is it moving into the role as well?
Okay, so let me talk about role first, because role helps us understand structure and what we expect out of everyone who works here. So the Army is an organization where uniformity rules the roost, right? We are supposed to be the same, look the same, engage in the same way, because these are called standard operating procedures, because when we go to war, we can't have people doing different things, right? That's sort of what the justification, the rationale that I get. So I think that becomes part of the tension in a conversation about diversity, is if everything's supposed to be the same all the time, then when people are different or something is different, is it bad if I treat somebody differently based on their race or their gender, especially if that means helping them differently in what could be construed as a positive, beneficial way? Because I thought we were all supposed to be the same here in the Army, and you see more of that. Or is that a sort of a good thing that I should be doing? So the identity dynamics complicate, I'm not using that as a negative word, but it complicates the notion of what I'm supposed to do as a professional who works here in this job, because it's introducing this notion of difference when standardization is what the larger value system is. So let me talk about the identities, right? For black men, they talk about the majority of them, and then I'll talk about the outliers. There's always outliers, right? The majority of them talk about, because I have had these experiences, and if I don't help women and minorities, they're not going to get help. That's the narrative that they have. Then there are the few who I won't say, they might say, I haven't had as many challenges, but one of the things that they acknowledge is their race, and that their race could be a liability if too many people became aware of the fact that they were thinking about race. So this is the person who would say something like, yeah, I'm black, right? However, I'm not going to go around like advertising that in a way that isn't just about people looking at me, because this is not a safe space for me to sort of engage with that identity in an open way. So it was like, yeah, I know there could be challenges, but I'm not going to sort of run them out there. So let me then give you the white counterexample. So there's the white male group that is sort of, this is not a conversation that they have, right? That's a lot of people. And then there's the ones who, either because they have a personal experience of feeling marginalized, this makes sense, or through experience, they've learned, this is the group that I really value because this sort of represents the group that I feel like is the next wave of being developed in this capacity, they've learned that this really is an issue. So they had an evolution. Maybe I didn't think it was an issue before, but then I started to see, either because of my black lieutenants or somebody who reported to me, or I had a black friend who was in the Army and they told me about it, or many of them, for as far as women is concerned, talked about the challenges that their wives experienced in their careers because they were deploying all the time, and that was starting to become a more salient dimension of difference that they could now see was affecting the women in the military. Because I problem solved this around my wife, I can now begin to think about this around people who report to me. So then let me tell you about the group of men who grew up, who talked about largely growing up in the southern rural US, under either conditions of what they perceived as extreme racism, or integration that was great for them because they represent low socioeconomic classes. And so they lived in communities with black people, and so it's not weird to them or strange or odd to them that they would all be in the same organization. So these were their friends. And so in their narratives is also embedded this notion of, this is not a strange thing to me. Of course I would help this person, but of course I also recognize that when you're not like the majority, people don't respond to you or help you in the same way. Does that help?
Yeah, and I guess I'm still just trying to make sense, and you parse this out, because there is the, like, it's my decision to help you based, am I recognizing your difference or not?
Yeah.
Which we don't usually do. But for the black officers, it seems like, for some, it's like, oh, it's my decision. Am I recognizing that I'm different or not? And then based on that decision, am I then going to recognize your difference? And then what are the limitations of me doing that based on me recognizing my own difference?
Yeah. So I think a lot of what I also hear in your question, and I think are my questions too, is I think people's awareness of themselves it varies widely in this study. I think some people are more comfortable, so let me actually tell you what was on the interview protocol so that you can sort of, I think, begin to understand why I'm answering the questions in this way. Is the first part of the interview for us is always like the warming up stage before we ask the hard questions. And so it was talk about you as a leader and your career experiences and how did you get to where you are today. And everyone loves this part of the interview, and then the last part of the interview is about, let's talk about identities, your work and your non-work identities. And so the first question is, so when you think about yourself and who you are, social identities, they could be your race, your gender. I start naming all of these. Which ones do you feel like are the most important to you, and do you think about those as being meaningful to you at work? The amount of silence that I get when we ask that question is much grander in this setting than it is with corporate people. A lot of people have a hard time answering identity questions. That's why I study it. But in this setting, it's like, well, I'm not sure what you're getting at by the question, right? So we do a lot of work around helping people to answer questions about identity. Certainly for the black men, if they didn't know that I already knew, I knew who was black and who was white, but if they didn't know that I knew, they would say, well, you know, I'm a black man, right? So, and I'm a big black man. I'm 250 pounds, I've got tattoos on my arms, everybody knows I'm black. So for me, it becomes about trying to reduce that threat when I'm walking around. So we did ask questions about that, but it did vary widely in terms of how easygoing of a reflection it was for people. And that's part of, I think, what's driving the results, is I'm trying to get them to talk about themselves, and then the other part is talking about other people's identities and whether or not they feel like they matter. And I had some people say, you know, this is a meritocracy. Of course we don't consider people's identities when we're considering promotions, right? So I got that a lot from some people as well across race. Yes?
So when the black men said that they were, you know, they were trying to help women, did anyone also mention that they helped people of other color, men or women? Latino men, for instance? So none of the black men acknowledged helping or wanting to help people of any other color except...
So they say, so basically their language for identities is women, minorities, not specified, but I feel like it means black, white, based on the examples people were giving me. And this many people would talk about people from the LG community. I wouldn't even say B or Z in this, or definitely not Q, right? So it's L, you know, so they were conscious of that might be a group, but that wasn't mentioned so much. They're standard examples, and they actually talked more, black and white, about minorities. That was the language, than about women, and that's what we had to ask about women. The one thing that I wanted to mention, I'm trying to figure out how to introduce this into the data, is this is where it was great that we had an interviewer who was a man, because I had already done about 5 or 6 interviews, and then the other interviewer reached out to me and said, I think I'm getting something different, because he'd seen a summary I'd written. I think I'm getting something different than you're getting, which was the point of this, right? And I said, what are you getting? And he says, this one officer is just saying all these things about women, like the worst stuff you could possibly hear. And so I'm like, okay, well, I'm gonna have to read this transcript. And so basically it was about women shouldn't be here, all they do is it creates issues, and the whole rest of it was about sexual harassment. Because what I have learned is that a large part of the gender narrative right now is how it's been constructed is through and via sexual harassment training. So that's the information that I'm getting about gender in the military. And so where he was concerned is like, because the minute that we introduce, this is a very heterosexual notion of, right, sexuality, the minute we introduce women into the militaries, then I have to do it, sexual harassment issues, and of course that's going to happen. These are women and these are men. So I just don't think that women should be in leadership positions, right? So yeah, so I think that might give you a little bit more insight into why it might be a little bit less of a rich understanding of the different groups, is because they have a very simplistic understanding of difference. Yes?
Would you be willing to share some of the preliminary hypotheses that are coming out of the interviews with the 2 Black women?
Yeah. Well, this is nothing that you don't already know if you follow the research, right? So it was just, so one of them was much more senior than the other, and she says how basically she sort of fought her whole career. She's a lieutenant colonel, had fought, and that's pretty high up, a couple levels down from general. Lieutenant colonel, then like general. 1 star, right? Okay. See, I'm learning. So lieutenant colonel, so she was talking about Black women, was talking about basically all the struggles that she faced, and having to navigate between being one of the boys and not being one of the boys. She said if I got any help, it was from the Black men, because they sort of, at least we related on the notion of race. And so, but she did say I wouldn't be to where I am unless I had, to Robert's point here, white male supervisors who were willing to be helpful. So it was all about the people who didn't help, and then in talking about how acknowledging that the white men did help, and then how the Black men helped, and the fact that they helped differently. The junior one, I just felt so bad for this person, the more junior person, because this person was saying, I can't get anybody to help me at all, right? And I sort of don't know what to do here, because she had wanted to, very passionate, went to West Point, right? So there was a large commitment here. I went to West Point, and I certainly am happy to be in this role, but unless, I know I'm not going to be able to get anywhere unless people start mentoring me, but everybody's sort of being a bit weird about this. So it's the reverse story. Yeah.
That was an excellent question. I was asked that exact same thing. Did you get feedback on why you, from the folks who said no, the women who said no? No.
No, we basically had a list, we cultivated a list of, and these were like some of these, Heisen went to like his close friends, because he has a lot of female friends who are in the military. He went to West Point, he's been in the military a long time, right? So I had a list of more than 100 names, and we've contacted multiple people on that list so many times. And then in the interviews, especially the people who weren't completely awkward about talking about women and minorities, I said, we actually do not have enough women in this study. We call snowball sampling in the qualitative world. Do you think that there are women who you could send this to? And some of them did, it's just don't participate. And I'm not saying that it's a study about race and gender. I think the way that we introduce it is a study about, your career experiences. But then I think for them, if race and gender they feel like it's salient and has played a role, then it might be like, I don't want to talk about this. I do also want to mention the fact that we got to remember to the notion of risk, in the military, there is something in this, right? Is you're not supposed to, so much is confidential. So even if I say I have IRB approval and this is all confidential, there's still a lot of worry around if my senior officer finds out, then I'm going to get in trouble.
Retribution.
Yeah, right. And so I think some of that might be fear. Interesting. If anybody has any ideas or has any friends, please let me know. Yes.
Yeah, I do have a book. I really like in Harvard book that is negotiating the negotiable things like race, gender, and all kinds of problems in the UN or in the military, wherever it is. It is by Daniel Shapiro.
Daniel Shapiro?
Yeah, he's a very award winner in the Harvard Law School professor. But what I was surprised is how this division, race, gender, all kinds of this thing, how it is really playing a very, very big role in the nerve of the people, and it brings the nations down. When people just divide into race, into gender, into color, into all kinds of things, then it's not going to profit humanity really. So how to overcome that is about this book explains how to overcome all that crisis in humanity. And I really highly recommend it. I'm very interested in it myself.
What's the name of the book?
The name of the book is How to Negotiate the Unnegotiable
How to
thing.
negotiate.
Yeah, that's what it.
Okay, you're gonna pass it to me? Okay, great, thank you so much.
It's very powerful.
Negotiating the non-negotiable, how to resolve your most emotionally charged conflicts. Oh, that's great. I have some other research that's about conflict more broadly, so thank you. I just want to have a reflection on this for a minute, also because I teach a diversity class, and I always feel the need to have a conversation, certainly open up to the group when people say, if we just didn't pay attention to differences, would this just be all better, right? So I had the distinct pleasure and honor of going on what I would call a faculty field trip. It's called the Faculty Immersion Trip that my school sponsors. And I went to Africa. And we went to South Africa, to Rwanda, and to Kenya, right? So this summer, spent 3 weeks there. I will say the first thing is, while it may be race and gender are the divisions here in the US, there are certainly other divisions in other countries. I learned in South Africa, it's actually still called race. And they talk about it much more in an explicit way than we do here in the US. So I think, and certainly when we look at, we then flew to Rwanda, where because of the genocide and the challenges that they had around the Hutus and the Tutsis, nobody wants to talk about ethnicity. It's like we don't use that word or talk about that at all. It's two different strategies. I ended up asking the government minister there, and basically their whole diversity conversation is about gender, right? About getting more women into leadership positions, particularly in the government. And I actually ended up asking the questions. I said, so part of the struggle for me is I study corporate practices when it comes to diversity and inclusion. And I know that a practice is if we're going to sort of think about the dimensions of difference that everybody can agree on are universally important, we're going to choose gender, because in any country around the world, people can argue that there's inequality, and we need to fix it. However, I think just because we're not talking in Rwanda about ethnicity because of the genocide does not mean that there aren't issues still. And part of my challenges is in creating this notion of blindness or suggesting that we shouldn't talk about it sometimes makes people believe that it's not an issue and that we shouldn't address it. So while I can agree, I think as a scholar and as an educator, that it would be great if we didn't have inequality, I prefer to sort of engage with the inequality so that we don't have a reason to believe that everything is fine. The idea is that when we do engage with it, it does create emotionally charged situations, as I'm learning from teaching this diversity class. But to the extent that we have positive solutions for working through it, there's a lot that can be learned and gained in the process. So that's sort of my perspective. I'm sure other people have perspectives, but I think that's how I think about my research and this teaching, is talking about difference and understanding differences is very important to moving forward. Yes?
So you mentioned this towards the beginning of your brief, and I wonder if you guys have given this thought, and maybe it's your project. Is there a plan to look at the NCO for the military? And I make this comment.
Yeah, say more about it. I think that would help everybody understand.
So I am a minority active military officer. One of the things that I think about a lot is that when we introduce concepts like race, gender, in officer settings, a lot of the people in the room are well-intentioned. And obviously I mean like the 80% whatever white male, very well-intentioned, absolutely want to do the right thing. But the military is pulling in a million different directions. I personally have really never felt racially discriminated against in the military. I felt much more outside the military. The NCO Corps, on the other hand, the non-commissioned officers, the enlisted ranks, have a much more diverse population in terms of race, and life is a lot harder in the enlisted ranks. So you confront issues much more directly, and a lot of the people that I've supervised and had the honor to work with, you get in situations that you really don't get into that often as an officer, right? That there is some decorum that we observe that prevents a lot of these things from happening. But if you're a frontline supervisor, you're an E6, so halfway between E1 and E9, and the guy right below you is black and you're white, and you have to have a really tough conversation with him, and you've never really dealt with race, and maybe you grew up in a mostly white community. Now you've got two issues, right? One, how do I run my shop properly? Two, how do I not get into a situation where I'm exposing myself to liability, or I am inadvertently, being an aggressor here in this situation beyond just being a supervisor. I think they deal with far more of this, and I think that I think there's more lesson to be learned there, honestly. And I think it could also explain why a lot of people don't respond to queries for surveys in the officer corps. It's so hard to get in to the officer corps in the first place. The numbers you're looking at are unbelievably small, and I would contend that minorities and women entering the officer corps in the first place are already such a small number that to see how they track after that point, I mean, just attrition, natural attrition is going to leave you with so few at the 05, 06 ranks, which is why we think about Michelle Howard, Colin Powell, and they're like, look at these people.
Right.
Well, incredible outliers, right? I mean, that's not data worthy in my opinion, but NCOs, like you said, 30% black, I think there is a story there, and I think that there's a lot of lessons to be shared.
So these are great insights, and you've got my wheels spinning around a couple of things. One is around research question, right? So one of the things when we do the research is like, what is it that you want to know? What's the phenomenon that you're trying to explain? And for us, the phenomenon was about the top of the organization. Is how do you understand why the top of the organization demographically looks the way that it does? From the perspective of people who are in position to potentially be at the top. So those enlisted officers are not in position to be generals someday. But the folks who we talk to are, so we're trying to understand getting into, it's a career leadership, how do we get into leadership positions and what are the barriers and challenges and opportunities? This, I think, addresses that. I think you're getting at another research question, which is actually one that I explore elsewhere, is looking at intergroup dynamics. And I think a little bit of this gets at the gender issue in the sample, is that, think about the fact that it was, I think 2 years ago, folks in the military, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's 2 years ago that all of a sudden we decided by policy that combat positions are open to women, yes?
Yes.
Okay, think about that. There are people who for the first time in their recent careers are working alongside women. So we're dealing with the same, I don't know what to do with this information, and now I've got to use the word woman versus just saying man, because man is just assumed as a way to describe all of us. That, to me, is a little bit like, how do I engage in a way that is effective and appropriate? That question is more like I think the enlisted question around engaging across race, when I might be from a place where people are not, they represent different backgrounds. I think the challenge, getting back to the gender piece for a second, is most of the narrative, it seems, that the men are getting about how to interact with people who you're not used to interacting with, which is about gender, is about liability and risk sexual harassment. So to the extent to which you're only training about interacting with somebody who you're not used to being around is about something about you could fall into legal trouble, then I think it becomes a little bit harder to interact, right? So it's no telling why I have officers making disclaimers around keeping the door open when they're mentoring female mentors, and please just go find a female mentor because that's easier. So I think your point is a great one, because I think it lends itself to a really interesting study looking at intergroup relationships for people who come into contact for the first time. I will say that there's a whole body of literature of this that started in the 50s and the 60s in the US, intergroup theory, where it was looking at the racial integration of all sorts of things, including schools and workforces. But yes, so to the extent that we want to go down that direction, this would be a great idea for future context. I think we have time for a few more questions. Yes? Okay.
Are you looking to expand your survey or the interviews at all within the Army or within any of the other services? And at the end, are you looking to have a product of either types of behavior that are useful or productive or not useful? And do you want to try to integrate that into leadership positions to try to become better, more inclusive, or better helping attitudes towards leaders?
Yeah, these are great questions. So I have another study where I looked broadly across the different services. And so I already had an understanding that there were some nuances, not necessarily on this topic, but just in terms of there are different, so there's some philosophies that differ based on the Army versus the Navy. And so if I started mixing up and trying to talk about race and gender, it'd be hard to attribute that to, it's like, do you keep the organization constant or do you look across organizations? So I think for us, if we wanted to develop a clearer understanding, if we just kept the organization, the Army constant, then we don't have to always attribute it to, well, that's because that's the Air Force and the Navy's different, right? So that was sort of why we did that. I had two visitors earlier before this presentation started. One was from the Navy and one was from the Air Force, and they said this is very similar. And so to your second point about what are we going to do with this information, so Heiss, as our designated military expert, he's going to help us understand that to the extent that this feels useful to the Army, what would be the way to package this in a way that gets to the right people. The two gentlemen who were here earlier, the active duty officers, gave a suggestion as that's the same in the Air Force and the Navy, but how do we talk about leadership slightly differently. We talk about, I think it was the Navy, we talk about this as the dimensions of leadership are character and competence. And so if you talk about this as being important to character development, then they might potentially understand in the Navy why it's important to even be talking about this to begin with. So they talked about framing and messaging differently to different services. So I think these are all opportunities. We just don't know how to do it. It's not my expertise. I think for me it's easy to relate this to a corporate audience, so I could see an Harvard Business Review and teach it in my classroom very easily, because this to me is completely transferable to the things that we want people who are in corporate sectors and students in classrooms to understand. But the other stuff is why we got an expert on the team. But this is, I think what today gave me, your comment and the gentleman who were here earlier, is the notion of this could spread to other groups in the military in addition to, we already knew it would spread outside the military. It would be transferable outside the military. Yes?
Have you looked at all the like different propensities of different groups to ask for help and to ask to be helped?
Yeah.
One of the things that strikes me, particularly about the US, but maybe other countries as well, is that there's a big premium put on putting yourself forward and saying, yes, I'm worthy of help and mentorship and sponsorship, but how do you go about distributing help evenly if some people don't, have the confidence or self-worth to do that?
So we're going to include that question on the battery of questions, I think, the next round for the people who we're interviewing, as well as their direct supports, because certainly, I think Linda Babcock, right? This is what she talks about with negotiation, is women don't ask her, and there's a huge controversy around, is that the case, the whole lean-in philosophy, right? Are you not leaning in? I don't know, so I'm going to ask as we go forward, just to see what, is that the two black women, it was the notion of, I've asked, but it is not helping. Or when I ask in some, it's not that people are saying, no, I won't help you. It's just, this is the kind of help that I need, and that's not the help that I'm getting. But I do understand that, because I have students, especially undergraduate students, is sometimes there's this perception for humans that you believe that people should just give it to you because you're here, rather than you actually have to say, this is the support that I need. So this would be a great thing to disentangle. Great insight. Yes?
I apologize if there's a name for this and it's been well studied and I'm just ignorant of it. But I have this sense that there's certain settings where the default is very strongly male, and there's certain settings that are gendered, but the default is not necessarily male. So the military seems like, if you want to be in the military and you're a woman, you will act male. I mean, I'm sure there's some subtlety there. I'm an economist by training. Economics is a very male profession. The women who are in economics tend to be women who are very comfortable in male settings, and that's changing, but it's still very true, I think. The NGO world, I worked at Oxfam for 5 years, is gendered. I mean, the top 15 in the organization at the time, there were only 2 women. It was very white. Well, let me talk about gender for now, because I'm sure there's an analogous question for race that's very important in ethnicity. But I don't feel like the culture at Oxfam was male, and if you're a woman, you had to fit in, even though there was a lot of gender dynamics. Is this an aspect that's studied, and if so, do you think that that aspect would reflect on the findings for helping? And you know, the parallel question about whether there's cultures and settings where the default is very heavily white and you fit in, versus there's a lot of racial issues, but the default is not as strongly. I mean, it's a different type of gender problem, not a more severe or less severe gender problem.
I think what you're getting at is certainly aligned with my own understanding of theory and practice on this topic. Is, you know, think leader, think male, and it's actually think white male in the United States. So goes without saying, there's a lot of research and a lot of evidence to suggest. I was talking earlier about with the gentlemen that were here, is that if we actually say, there was a study that was done, I can't remember whose study was done, if you can remember the OB scholars, and then let me know. There's a study that was asking, I think it's based on a social psych study, is ask people to draw pictures of what a leader looks like is a man, right? So I think to your point, yes, if that's the case. I think the other thing that we need to think about here is if how much of this is about male-dominated organizations, and if you move to female-dominated organizations, is it different? Or how much is this just about the fact that our society is constructed around male-dominated norms, right, of who professional workers are? I would argue also for the latter, is that even when you change or even you study like nursing, those leaders at the top, they're predominantly men, even though the workforce might be 85, 90% female, and the norms are still more masculine than they are feminine. So it might not be as strongly stereotypically masculine norms, but it's still there. And I think if, to the extent that we're getting those findings, it's because of the fact that we live in a society that still has these strong social norms around, with, you know, masculine notions of being, I think, are embedded in our structures. So we are actually, I think we do need to end soon. So I want to make sure, I will stay for a few more minutes, because I know that there were some hands up, but I want to be conscious of, I know people are trying to run. Are you closing us out, or am I closing us out?
You can.
Yep.
I was just going to thank everybody for coming, and this was a very enlightening and engaging conversation and presentation, and wish you a safe journey back to Philly.
Thank you so much. I'll be here.